Excerpt from A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Quote, England was fighting a series of wars, Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, King George's War in the 1730s. And some merchants made fortunes from these wars, but for most people, they meant higher taxes, employment, and poverty. An anonymous pamphleteer in Massachusetts, writing angrily after King George's War, described the situation. Quote, Poverty and discontent appear in every face except the countenances of the rich, and dwell upon every tongue. He spoke of a few men, fed by, quote, lust of power, lust of fame, lust of money, end quote, who got rich during the war. Quote, no wonder such men can build ships, houses, buy farms, set up their coaches, chariots, live very splendidly, purchase fame, posts of honor, end quote. He called them, quote, birds of prey, enemies to all communities wherever they live, end quote. The forced service of seamen led to a riot against impressment in Boston in 1747. Then crowds turned against Thomas Hutchinson, a rich merchant and colonial official who had backed the governor in putting down the riot, and who also designed a currency plan for Massachusetts, which seemed to discriminate against the poor. Hutchinson's house burned down mysteriously, and a crowd gathered in the street, cursing Hutchinson and shouting, "Let it burn." By the years of the Revolutionary Crisis, the 1760s, the wealthy elite that controlled the British colonies on the American mainland had 150 years of experience and had learned certain things about how to rule. They had various fears, but also had developed tactics to deal with what they feared. The Indians, they had found, were too unruly to keep as a labor force and remained an obstacle to expansion. Black slaves were easier to control, and their profitability for southern plantations was bringing an enormous increase in the importation of slaves, who were becoming a majority in some colonies, and constituted 1/5 of the entire colonial population. But the black people were not totally submissive, and as their numbers grew, the prospect of slave rebellion grew. With the problem of Indian hostility and the danger of slave revolts, the colonial elite had to consider the class anger of poor whites. Servants, tenants, the city poor, the propertyless, the taxpayer, the soldier, and the sailor. As the colonies passed their 100th year and went into the middle of the 1700s, as the gap between rich and poor widened, as violence and the threat of violence increased, the problem of control became more serious. What if these different, despised groups, the Indians, the slaves, the poor whites, should combine? Even before there were so many black people in the 17th century, there was, as Abbott Smith put it, quote, a lively fear that servants would join with Negroes or Indians to overcome the small number of masters, end quote. There was little chance that whites and Indians would combine in North America as they were doing in South and Central America, where the shortage of women and the use of Indians on the plantations led to daily contact. Only in Georgia and South Carolina, where white women were scarce, was there some sexual mixing of white men and Indian women. In general, the Indian had been pushed out of sight, out of touch. One fact disturbed. Whites would run off to join Indian tribes or would be captured in battle and brought up among the Indians, and when this happened with the whites, given a chance to leave, chose to stay in the Indian culture. Indians, having the choice, almost never decided to join the whites. Hector St. Jean Crevecoeur, the Frenchman who lived in America for almost 20 years, told in Letters from an American Farmer how children captured during the 7 Years' War and found by their parents, grown up and living with Indians, would refuse to leave their new families. Quote, there must be in their social bond, quote, he said, quote, something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted among us, for thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of these aborigines having, from choice, become Europeans, end quote. But this affected few people. In general, the Indian was kept at a distance, and the colonial officialdom had found a way of alleviating the danger. By monopolizing the good land on the eastern seaboard, they forced landless whites to move westward to the frontier, there to encounter the Indians and to be a buffer for the rich seaboard rich against Indian troubles, whites becoming more dependent on the government for protection. Bacon's rebellion was instructive. To conciliate a diminishing Indian population at the expense of infuriating a coalition of white frontiersmen was very risky. Better to make war on the Indian, gain the support of the white, divert possible class conflict by turning poor whites against Indians for the security of the elite. Might blacks and Indians combine against the white enemy? in the northern colonies except on Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Rhode Island, where there was close contact and sexual mixing, there was not much opportunity for Africans and Indians to meet in large numbers. New York had the largest slave population in the north, and there was some contact between blacks and Indians, as in 1712, when Africans and Indians joined in an insurrection. But this was quickly suppressed. In the Carolinas, however, whites were outnumbered by black slaves and nearby Indian tribes. In the 1750s, 25,000 whites faced 40,000 black slaves with 60,000 Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw Indians in that area. Gary Nash writes, quote, Indian uprisings that punctuated the colonial period and a succession of slave uprisings and insurrectionary plots that were nipped in the bud kept South Carolinians sickeningly aware that only through the greatest vigilance and through policies designed to keep their enemies divided could they hope to remain in control of the situation, end quote. The white rulers of the Carolinas seemed to be conscious of the need for a policy, as one of them put it, quote, to make Indians and Negroes a check upon each other, lest by their vastly superior numbers we should be crushed by one or the other, end quote. And so, laws were passed prohibiting free black people from traveling in Indian country. Treaties from Indian tribes contained clauses requiring the return of fugitive slaves. Governor Littleton of South Carolina wrote in 1738, quote, "It has always been the policy of this government to create an aversion in them, Indians, to Negroes," end quote. Part of this policy involved using black slaves in the South Carolina militia to fight Indians. Still, the government was worried about black revolt, and during the Cherokee War in the 1760s, a motion to equip 500 slaves to fight the Indians lost in the Carolina Assembly by a single vote. Black people ran away to Indian villages, and the Creeks and Cherokees harbored runaway slaves by the hundreds. Many of these were amalgamated into the Indian tribes, married, produced children. But the combination of harsh slave codes and bribes to the Indians to help put down black rebels kept everything under control. It was the potential combination of poor whites and blacks that caused the most fear among the wealthy white planters. If there had been the natural racial repugnance that some theorists had assumed, control would have been easier. But sexual attraction was powerful across racial lines. In 1743, a grand jury in Charleston, South Carolina, denounced the, quote, too common practice of criminal conversation with Negro and other slave wenches in this province, end quote. Mixed offspring continued to be produced by black and white sex relations through the colonial period, in spite of laws prohibiting interracial marriage in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and Georgia. By declaring the children illegitimate, they would keep them inside the black families so that the white population would remain, quote, pure, end quote, and in control. What made Bacon's rebellion especially fearsome for the rulers of Virginia was that black slaves and white servants joined forces. The final surrender was by, quote, 400 English and Negroes in arms, quote, end quote, at one garrison, and 300, quote, freemen and African and English bond servants, end quote, in another garrison. The naval commander who subdued the 400 wrote, quote, most of them I persuaded to go to their homes, which accordingly they did, except about 80 Negroes and 20 English, which would not deliver their arms, end quote. All through those early years, black and white slaves and servants ran away together, as shown both by the laws passed to stop this and the records of the courts. In 1698, South Carolina passed a quote, deficiency law, end quote, requiring plantation owners to have at least one white servant for every 6 male adult Negroes. A letter from the Southern colonies in 1682 complained of, quote, no white men to superintend our Negroes or repress an insurrection of Negroes, end quote. In 1691, the House of Commons received a, quote, petition of divers merchants, masters of ships, planters, and others trading to foreign plantations, setting forth that the plantations cannot be maintained without a considerable number of white servants, as well to keep the blacks in subjection as to bear arms in case of invasion, end quote. A report to the English government in 1721 said that in South Carolina, quote, black slaves have lately attempted and were very near succeeding in a new revolution, and therefore it may be necessary to propose some new law for encouraging the entertainment of more white servants in the future. The militia of this province does not consist of above 2,000 men." End quote. Apparently, 2,000 were not considered sufficient to meet the threat. This fear may help explain why Parliament in 1717 made transportation to the New World a legal punishment for crime. After that, tens of thousands of convicts could be sent to Virginia, Maryland, and other colonies. It also makes understandable why the Virginia Assembly, after Bacon's Rebellion, gave amnesty to white servants who had rebelled, but not to black people. Negroes were forbidden to carry any arms, while whites finishing their servitude would get muskets along with corn and cash. The distinctions of status between white and black servants became more and more clear. In the 1720s, with fear of slave rebellion growing, white servants were allowed in Virginia to join the militia as substitutes for white freemen. At the same time, slave patrols were established in Virginia to deal with the, quote, "great dangers that may happen by the insurrections of Negroes," end quote. Poor white men would make up the rank and file of these patrols and get the monetary reward. Racism was becoming more and more practical. Edmund Morgan, on the basis of his careful study of slavery in Virginia, sees racism not as, quote, "natural," quote, end quote, to black and white difference, but something coming out of class scorn, a realistic device for control. Quote, "If free men with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon had done." End quote. The answer to the problem, obvious if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism, to separate dangerous free whites from dangerous black slaves by a screen of racial contempt. There was still another control which had become handy as the colonies grew, which had crucial consequences for the continued rule of the elite throughout American history. Along with the very rich and the very poor, there developed a white middle class of small planters, independent farmers, city artisans, who, given small rewards for joining forces with merchants and planters, would be a solid buffer against black slaves, frontier Indians, and very poor whites. The growing cities generated more skilled workers, and the governments cultivated the support of white mechanics by protecting them from the competition of both slaves and free Negroes. As early as 1686, the council in New York ordered that, quote, "no Negro or slave be suffered to work on the bridge as a porter about any goods either imported or exported from or into the city," end quote. In the southern towns, too, white craftsmen and traders were protected from Negro competition. In 1764, the South Carolina legislature prohibited Charleston masters from employing Negroes or other slaves as mechanics or in handicraft trades. Middle-class Americans might be invited to join a new elite by a tax against the corruption of the established rich. The New Yorker called Wallander Golden in his address to the freeholders in 1747, attacked the wealthy as tax dodgers unconcerned with the welfare of others, although he himself was wealthy. And he spoke for the honesty and dependability of the, quote, "middling rank of mid-kind," end quote, in whom citizens could best trust, quote, "our liberty and property," end quote. This was to become a critically important rhetorical device for the rule of the few, who would speak to the many of, quote, "our," end quote, "liberty," and, quote, "our," end quote, "property," quote, "our country," as well. Similarly, in Boston, the rich James Otis could appeal to the Boston middle class by attacking Tory Thomas Hutchinson. James Henrietta has shown that while it was the rich who ruled Boston, there were political jobs available for the moderately well-off as, quote, "cullers of staves," end quote, "measurers of coal baskets, fence viewer," etc. Aubrey Land found in Maryland a class of small planters who were not, quote, "the beneficiary," end quote, of the planting society, as the rich were, but who had the distinction of being called planters, who were, quote, "respectable citizens with community obligations to act as overseers of roads, appraisers of estates, and similar duties," end quote. It helped the Alliance to accept the middle class solidly in a, quote, "round of activities that included local politics, dances, horse racing, and cockfights, occasionally punctuated with drinking brawls," end quote. The Pennsylvania Journal wrote in 1756, quote, "the people of this province are generally of the middling sort, and at present pretty much upon a level. They are chiefly industrious fanners, artificers, or men in trade. They enjoy and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them thinks he has a right to civility from the greatest," end quote. Indeed, there was a substantial middle class fitting that description. To call them, quote, "the people," quote, end quote, was to omit black slaves, white servants, and displaced Indians, and the term, quote, middle class, end quote, concealed a fact long true about this country, that as Richard Hofstadter said, quote, it was a middle-class society governed for the most part by its upper classes, end quote. These upper classes to rule needed to make concessions to the middle class without damage to their own wealth or power at the expense of slaves, Indians, and poor whites. This bought loyalty, and to bind that loyalty with something more powerful even than material advantage, the ruling group found, in the 1760s and 1770s, a wonderfully useful device. That device was the language of liberty and equality, which could unite just enough whites to fight a revolution against England without ending either slavery or inequality, end quote. Bibliography citations. Zinn, Howard, A People's History of the United States, HarperCollins, 2003.